Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the smell of wet stone and burning fat. Imagine a darkness so thick it feels like something alive pressing against your skin. Imagine the sound of 10,000 feet stamping against the earth above your head, the vibrations traveling down through layers of Roman engineering, through marble and mortar and ancient compressed soil, until they reach you, trembling up through the cold floor and into the soles of your bare feet, like a heartbeat that is not your own. This is the hypogeum, the world beneath the world. Long before the Colosseum became the sun-bleached ruin that tourists photograph today, before it became a symbol of a civilization's grandeur, it was something else entirely. It was a machine, a vast, calculated, mercilessly engineered machine designed for one purpose: to produce death in the most spectacular way the human mind could devise. And like any great machine, its most important parts were the ones you never saw. The gears turning in the dark, the mechanisms hidden below the surface. The hypogeum was a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers stretching beneath the arena floor, covering nearly 6,000 square meters of subterranean space. There were 80 vertical shafts built into its design, each one connected to a system of ropes, pulleys, and counterweights, so sophisticated that engineers of the modern era have spent decades trying to fully understand them. Through these shafts, animals could be lifted directly onto the sand in seconds. A lion appearing from nowhere, a bear materializing from the earth itself, as if conjured by Roman gods hungry for entertainment. But animals were not the only things stored in the dark below. The prisoners moved through these corridors in chains, guided by torchlight and the rough hands of guards who had long since stopped seeing them as people. The women among them, and there were always women, taken from every corner of the conquered world, walked with their eyes adjusting to a darkness that never fully lifted. The torches burned oil that smelled rancid and thick. The walls wept moisture. In certain chambers you could hear the animals through the walls, the low, restless movement of creatures that had been starved deliberately, kept on the edge of fury so they would perform properly when the gates opened above. The hypogeum was designed to disorient. Deliberately, a prisoner who did not know which direction led to the surface was a prisoner too confused to plan, too frightened to resist. The corridors curved without logic. Chambers opened into other chambers. The sounds from above were amplified strangely by the acoustics of the stone, so that the roaring of the crowd became something inhuman, something atmospheric, like a storm that had moved indoors. For the women stumbling through those corridors, the hypogeum was not just a holding place, it was the first lesson Rome intended to teach them. A lesson with no words, delivered entirely through stone and shadow, and the distant, thunderous hunger of a crowd they had not yet seen. The lesson was simple. You are already underground. You are already buried. Whatever you were before you arrived here, daughter, mother, warrior, wife, that person is already gone. There was a moment before all of this when their lives were ordinary. That is the thing history most often forgets when it speaks of captives and prisoners and the condemned. It skips past the before. It rushes towards the spectacle, toward the chains and the sand and the roaring crowd, and in doing so, it commits a quiet violence of its own, erasing the ordinary warmth of the lives that existed before the soldiers came, before the smoke rose, before the world as they knew it was folded up and taken away like a tent after a festival, leaving nothing behind but scorched earth and silence. She may have woken that morning to the sound of her children, or to the smell of bread, or to the particular quality of light that falls through the gaps in a thatched roof. In the earliest part of the day, soft and golden, and full of the specific promise that only ordinary mornings carry. She did not know as she opened her eyes that this was the last ordinary morning she would ever have. People never do. Rome did not conquer quietly. The legions moved like weather, inevitable, impersonal, vast. By the 1st century of the Common Era, the empire had stretched its borders across an almost incomprehensible sweep of the known world. Britannia in the cold northwest, Gaul across the rolling green hills of what is now France, Thrace along the rugged Balkan coastline, Numidia burning gold and hot across North Africa, Judea with its ancient complicated heart. Each of these places had people, families, languages, gods of their own. None of that mattered to the calculus of Roman expansion. When a village resisted, and many did, with whatever weapons they had, with whatever desperate courage ordinary people summon when their homes are threatened, the response was systematic and merciless. The men who fought were often killed where they stood. The men who surrendered were evaluated for labour, and the women, the children, the elderly, they were gathered, counted, assigned a value, loaded onto carts or marched on foot, sometimes for hundreds of miles, toward the great ports of the empire, where slave traders waited with their ledgers open and their eyes cold and professional. The journey itself was a form of destruction. It is difficult to hold on to who you are when everything that told you who you were has been taken away. Your language becomes useless when no one around you speaks it. Ye. Our name, pronounced by a Roman tongue that cannot shape its sounds correctly, becomes unrecognizable. The gods you prayed to are not here in this strange flat light, on this road that smells of dust and unwashed bodies, and the iron of the chains at your wrists. Historians estimate that at the peak of Roman imperial power, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of the city of Rome itself consisted of enslaved people. The machine required constant feeding. Every conquered territory was a harvest, and some harvests were delivered directly to the arena. Rome loved many things. It loved marble and wine and the complex poetry of political betrayal. It loved engineering, aqueducts that carried water across impossible distances, roads that cut through mountains as though the mountains had simply been asked politely to move. It loved spectacle and ceremony, and the particular intoxication of collective experience, tens of thousands of people breathing the same air and feeling the same thing at the same moment. But more than almost anything else, Rome loved the arena. And the arena, like everything Rome built, was not a spontaneous eruption of passion. It was a business. At the centre of that business stood a figure that history has never quite decided how to feel about: the lanista. The lanista was, in the simplest terms, a trader in human combat. He bought bodies, trained them, fed them, maintained them and rented them out to the editors, the men who funded and organised the games. He was part businessman, part trainer, part warden, and part showman. Roman society regarded him with a curious mixture of financial respect and deep social contempt. He was necessary and profitable, and absolutely not someone you invited to dinner with the respectable classes. The lanista operated out of a facility called the ludus. These training schools existed throughout the empire, but the most significant were clustered around Rome itself, and the grandest of all was the Ludus Magnus, the great school built directly adjacent to the Colosseum, connected to the arena by an underground tunnel so that gladiators could be moved to the sand without ever appearing in public beforehand. It held perhaps 1,000 people at capacity. It had its own training arena, its own medical facilities, its own hierarchy of authority. When a shipment of captives arrived, from the docks at Ostia, from the slave markets of Capua, from the private estates of generals who had taken prisoners in the field, the lanista, or his representatives, would be there to evaluate them. This evaluation was coldly practical: age, physical condition, apparent strength, any previous fighting experience, the region they came from, and therefore the fighting style they might be trained in. Every factor was assessed and translated into a number, a price. Women moved through this system too, and their valuation followed a different, and in many ways more disturbing logic. A woman with obvious physical strength might be considered for combat training. The gladiatrix was rare but not unheard of, and a female fighter on the sand was a novelty that commanded premium ticket prices. But most women were not routed toward the sword. They were routed towards something the Romans called the damnatio, the condemnation ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. The damnatio ad ludum, condemnation to the games in their broader, more varied and often more theatrical forms. These were legal sentences, handed down by Roman courts, or by the will of the emperor himself, and they covered a spectrum of fates so wide and so deliberately inventive that it is difficult to read the historical record without a deepening sense of dread. The machine did not hate the women who passed through. That would have required the machine to see them at all. There is a particular cruelty in theatre, in the difference between a death that is simply death, brutal and final but at least honest in its brutality, and a death that has been dressed up, costumed, scripted, and performed for an audience eating lunch in the midday sun. Rome understood this difference with an intimacy that should disturb us. Rome did not merely kill its condemned. It produced them, the morning executions, the ludi meridiani, occupied the midday slot of arena programming deliberately. The true gladiatorial combats, the ones featuring trained fighters whose names the crowd knew and whose skills they had debated in the taverns the night before, those came later in the afternoon when the best seats were full and the atmosphere was electric. The midday slot was considered lesser entertainment. It was where the condemned were processed, and the crowd that stayed to watch, not everyone did, some went for food, some went home, was treated to something that the Romans had elevated, with characteristic thoroughness, into an art form of degradation. The mythological spectacle was among the most documented and most chilling of these productions. Rome's arena designers were students of mythology, and they applied their knowledge with a showman's instinct for maximum impact. If a woman was to die in the arena, why arrange a simple death when the story of Dirce existed? Dirce, from Greek mythology, was punished by being tied to the horns of a wild bull and dragged to her death. Roman arena producers recreated this scene with living people. A condemned woman, chosen perhaps for her appearance, perhaps simply because she was available, would be costumed, positioned, and bound to an actual bull. The crowd would recognize the tableau. They would feel the pleasure of cultural recognition layered over this. Spectacle of real death. There was the fate of Pasiphae. There was the fate of Orpheus, reimagined with female condemned in supporting roles that required no survival. The Romans collected myths the way they collected conquered peoples, as raw material to be processed and displayed. And the women of the hypogeum, those captives from Gaul and Thrace and Britannia, who had never heard these Greek stories, who had no framework for understanding why they were being costumed and positioned in ways that made the crowd lean forward with anticipation. They died inside narratives that were not their own, for an audience that did not know their names. The beasts require their own accounting. The Romans maintained a staggering menagerie. Lions, bears, leopards, crocodiles, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, animals pulled from every corner of the empire at enormous expense and kept deliberately hungry in the chambers of the hypogeum. Historians estimate that over the centuries of the arena's operation, the appetite for exotic animals was so vast that certain species in North Africa were hunted to regional extinction. Against these animals, condemned women were sent with nothing, no weapon, no armor, no mercy built into the design of the moment. The crowd above had paid for a performance. The performance required an ending. And Rome, in all its sophisticated and terrible creativity, always delivered exactly what it promised. But not all of them broke. That is the sentence history least expects you to read in a story like this. 1. After the darkness of the hypogeum and the cold arithmetic of the lanistas' ledger and the theatrical horror of the mythological spectacles, it feels almost impossible to believe that resistance existed, that some women looked at the machine Rome had built around them and found, somewhere in the exhausted and battered architecture of themselves, something. G that refused to be processed, something that pushed back. The gladiatrix. Even the word feels surprising, like a door opening in a wall you were certain was solid. Female gladiators existed. This is not speculation or romantic myth-making. It is documented historical fact, confirmed through a combination of Roman legal texts, satirical literature, archaeological evidence, and most strikingly, a carved marble relief discovered in the ancient city of Halicarnassus in what is now southwestern Turkey. The relief, dated to somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, depicts two female fighters in full gladiatorial equipment, helmets, arm guards, curved shields, short swords. Their names are carved beneath them. Amazon, Achilia. They are shown in the moment after combat, having apparently fought each other to a draw, both being granted the missio, the mercy that allowed a fighter who had performed with honor to leave the sand alive. Amazon, Achilia, two names. Carved in stone, surviving 2,000 years because someone thought their fight was worth remembering. The Roman relationship with female gladiators was, like so many Roman relationships, deeply contradictory. On one hand, the gladiatrix was considered a novelty, a transgression of the natural order that made her simultaneously fascinating and faintly ridiculous in the eyes of the male Roman commentators who wrote about her. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century, mocked wealthy Roman women who paid for gladiatorial training as a hobby, describing their enthusiasm with the particular contempt reserved for things that both attract and unsettle. He was not writing about captive women fighting for survival. He was writing about women of leisure who chose the sword for sport. But that distinction matters enormously, because behind the satirical commentary about bored aristocratic women playing at combat, there were other women, the ones who had not chosen any of this, learning to fight because fighting was the only language the arena understood, because the sword, however terrible the circumstances that placed it in your hand, was still a sword, still a chance. Training was brutal and methodical. The rudis, the wooden practice sword, came first, used against the palace, a thick wooden post driven into the ground of the training yard. Footwork, balance, the geometry of attack and defense. The body had to be rebuilt from the inside out, its instincts rewired, its fear converted into something useful and controlled. Trainers called doctors pushed their charges with the same practical investment a craftsman brings to an expensive tool. Survival in the arena required more than strength. It required presence. The crowd had to feel something when they looked at you. And some of these women, standing on the sand with the sun hammering down and the crowd's noise pressing against them like a physical force, gave the crowd something they had not expected to feel. Let us talk about the people in the seats, because the arena did not exist in isolation. It did not operate in some moral vacuum separate from the civilization that built it. Every death on that sand, every woman dragged into the light of the midday sun, every condemned prisoner dressed in a costume they did not understand, for a story they had never heard. All of it happened because tens of thousands of ordinary Romans climbed the stone steps of the Colosseum on a bright morning, found their seats, unwrapped their food, and watched, and came back the next day, and brought their children. Understanding how that was possible is perhaps the most unsettling historical question the arena asks us to confront. The Colosseum at full capacity held somewhere between 50 and 80,000 people. Its seating was arranged with the precision of a society that understood hierarchy in its bones. The emperor and his immediate circle occupied the imperial box, positioned for the perfect sightline. Senators sat closest to the sand in the front rows called the imakaveia, near enough to smell the blood and the animals. Behind them sat the equestrian class, the wealthy merchants and military officers who formed Rome's broad middle tier of power. Higher still sat the general population, freedmen, common citizens, the working poor of Rome packed into the upper tiers. And at the very top, in the cheapest and most exposed positions, women of the non-senatorial classes and the very poorest citizens pressed together under the open sky. The architecture itself was a lesson in Roman values. Where you sat told you exactly who you were, and everyone, from the emperor to the man selling cushions at the gate, was participating in the same shared ritual of Roman identity. That ritual had a long history and a deliberate political function. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, was coined by the poet Juvenal as a criticism, a sardonic observation that the Roman populace had been pacified with free grain and free entertainment, their appetite for political participation replaced by an appetite for spectacle. But the phrase has outlasted its cynicism to become something closer to simple truth. The games were state policy. Emperors funded them lavishly because a crowd that had been given something extraordinary to watch was a crowd not thinking about the cost of grain, or the corruption of officials, or the question of who should be sitting in the imperial box. The Roman crowd was not a mob of monsters. That is the comfortable conclusion, and it is wrong. They were people shaped by a culture that had spent centuries normalizing what they were, watching. Children grew up hearing about the games before they ever attended one. The gladiator was a figure of popular culture, his image stamped on oil lamps painted on tavern walls, scratched into the plaster of Pompeii, in declarations of adoration that feel startlingly familiar to anyone who has ever followed a sports team with irrational devotion. The crowd cheered because cheering was what you did. Because the alternative, sitting in silence, refusing the spectacle, acknowledging the humanity of the figures on the sand, would have required a kind of moral imagination that no society freely grants its members when the cost of that imagination is the loss of something they enjoy. Rome did not cheer because it was evil. It cheered because it had never been taught to stop. Every arena has a moment after. The crowd has gone. The torches in the hypogeum have burned down to their last guttering inch. The sand above, raked smooth by the arena workers who moved through the aftermath with the quiet efficiency of men who had learned not to think too carefully about what they were raking, holds no visible evidence of what happened today. Tomorrow it will hold no evidence of what happened yesterday. The sand was designed for exactly this, to absorb and conceal, to take the blood and return a clean surface, to make the next spectacle possible by erasing the last one completely. This erasure was not accidental. It was the final and most complete act of the Roman arena's power over the people who passed through it. The women who survived, and some did survive, though survival inside the Roman entertainment machine was rarely the uncomplicated gift the word implies, emerged into a world that had no real place for them. A gladiatrix who won her freedom, awarded the rudis the symbolic wooden sword that meant no more fighting, was technically free. But freedom in Rome was a landscape with very few landmarks for a woman who had arrived in chains from a village that no longer existed. The language she had grown up speaking might be useless here. The family she had been taken from was gone, dead, dispersed, absorbed into the same vast system that had swallowed her. The gods she had prayed to had no temples in this city. Some found their way into the margins of Roman society, working in the establishments that clustered around the arenas, living in the dense and complicated neighborhoods where former slaves and freed people and migrants built their own fragile communities inside the empire's indifferent body. Some became trainers themselves, passing on the knowledge of survival to the next generation of condemned. Some simply disappeared from the record entirely, which is its own kind of answer. History, as it was written by Rome, was not interested in preserving their stories. The historians and poets and satirists who left us our primary sources wrote for Roman audiences, from Roman perspectives, with Roman assumptions about whose experiences were worth recording. A senator's career was worth documenting. An emperor's eccentricities were worth documenting. The inner life of a Thracian woman standing on the sand of the Colosseum, with the crowd's noise breaking over her like a wave. That was not considered material for the historical record, and so they almost disappeared entirely. Almost, but archaeology is a different kind of memory. The relief at Halicarnassus with its 2 carved fighters and their names, Amazon Achillea, survived because stone is stubborn and time is imperfect in its destructions. Graffiti scratched into Pompeii's walls survived because a volcano, in its terrible indiscriminate preservation, buried everything equally, the grand and the humble, the celebrated and the forgotten. Fragments of legal texts passing refer, enses in satirical poems, brief notations in administrative records. These small survivals accumulate, and in their accumulation they push back against the silence Rome intended. To remember these women now, in this age, across this distance of centuries, is not a small thing. It is an act of restoration. It returns to them something the arena was specifically designed to take. The acknowledgement that they existed, that they suffered, that some of them fought back, and that their stories belong to history as fully and as permanently as the emperors who watched from the imperial box and never learned any of their names. The gates of the Colosseum are open to tourists now. People walk through them with cameras and guidebooks, tilting their heads back to look at the ancient stones stacked against the Roman sky. They photograph the arena floor, the hypogeum visible below through the gaps where the wooden surface once lay. They stand exactly where the sand was, exactly where it happened. The women who passed through here deserve to be remembered in that moment of looking down. They deserve to be part of what we see when we see this place. They were here. They were real. And now, at last, so is their story.